What are the three exercises I do the most with team sports athletes? Back squat, chin-ups, good mornings. So these are like listen, I use a ton of exercises, but consistently, these are used a lot because the back squat, it's a mother lift. The frequency of training you can do with back squat is much higher than the other lift. The chin-up, simply because the chin-up is repeated on both upper body days, so obviously the overall volume of chins compared to other lifts will be greater. And the good morning, in terms of remedial posterior chain exercise, I use it a lot simply because almost every athlete that I assessed are really, really weak in the lower back, and most specifically the bottom range of the posterior chain movement. So that's why I emphasize these. So now don't read this comment as, okay, then all I need to do is squats, chins, and good mornings, and I'll be good to go. No, these are just straight up the exercises that on a sheer volume I might have more than others with the preparation of my athletes. Is the percentage of step loading always 10%, or it depends on the amount of sets? So it does depend on the amount of sets. Now, the reason why I promote 10 to 12% is because the majority of my training programs, the A series, those standard sets in which I will use step loading, they tend to fall in the 4 to 6 sets window, which for these amount of sets, that 10 to 12% range seems to be ideal. Now, if you ever were to do workouts where you have 10 or maybe 12 sets, now you have to expand that range because there's so many sets, and using only a 10% window with that many sets becomes way too restrictive. So if you're doing 10 or 12 sets, you might want to use 15 or 20% windows, even more so if we're doing lower body exercises. You might want to be closer to 20% because now you just need more room to create your step loads. So now the disadvantage is the first few sets. You're going to be a little bit further out of the intensity realm you're trying to target, but it's okay because you have so many sets. So you almost have to look at those first few sets as rehearsal and neural potentiating sets. So if you're doing 10 or 12, push that range to 15 to 20%, even more so with lower body, because 10% is just too narrow. But for the majority of the time, 4 to 6 sets, 10% is your sweet spot. When bringing up the bench, do I use the 90-degree rule for the entire macrocycle? So the answer is yes. So even if you're trying to improve the bench, it does not mean that for 12 weeks straight, you're going to bench press every week. If you do that, it's fine. It will work. It can work. But me, I'm always I want to create the best, the biggest, and the fastest improvement on a lift, but not at the expense of potential injury risk or long-term stressors that can lead to chronic injuries. So to me, to bench press consistently 12 weeks straight with a barbell, the likelihood of creating pattern overload syndrome effects at the shoulder joints are too high. So because of that, I like to train the bench press in the intensification phases where the goal of that mesocycle is to increase load, which is what I'm trying to achieve by improving my bench. And now what I do is the 2 accumulation phases where I'm building a little bit more volume of work. I use the angles above, which would be my incline press, in order to drive a training response on my extensor. But we have to understand that angles above always improves angles below. And the reason is, if we look at the 4 pressing movement, the overhead press, that's our weakest link. The second weakest is the incline. Then we have the bench press, flat. Then our strongest is dip. So you see, we're stronger in the bottom, and the higher we go, we become weaker and weaker and weaker. So if I'm straightening the top, the radiating effect and strength will go downwards as well. So that's why you can have your accumulation phases focusing on incline press and still have a trickle down effect to improving your bench press, where you're emphasizing on a load perspective in the intensification phase. And then remember that you always finish a macro with an intensification 2, where now you're actually peaking that bench press in that phase to create the highest potential estimated 1RM value. But aside from that, now the 90-degree principle will be done within the training session and within the microcycle, so the training week. So whenever I'm doing bench press in my intensification phases, my other upper body lift will be overhead press to create a 90-degree principle. And then in my accumulation phases where I'm doing incline press, the other upper body lift will be dip to create the 90-degree principle. And then within the session, I'm also doing 90-degree principle. Okay, so I always stick to it. It's been working really, really well for me, not only to get significant gains on these primary lifts, but to also push away or diminish the potential of injury of pattern overload, which is very, very important when you're training clients in the long term. So to me, it's a non-negotiable component. I use a 90-degree principle. The benefits are just there, so why change? During accumulation phases, should you do every set at your 100% of RM? No. So here's the rule, and it's the same rule always. Your A series primary compound multi-joint movements, irrespective of if it's done in accumulation phases or intensification phases, if you're using standard sets, which would be, let's say, 5x6, you always use step loading using a 10% range, no matter if it's accumulation or intensification. The primary exercises, you're looking for technique rehearsal, quality work, attaining your volume target, meaning that you don't want to be short of the rep prescription, and you want a high quality workout that's hard, but only your last set or last 2 sets max should be the complete failure. If you make the mistake to achieve failure on your first set, you will have a drop off. You will have a drop off in rep and or load, which means that on a tonnage perspective, you will end up with less tonnage than if you were to create a good, steady 10% step up progression, step loading progression. Okay, so it doesn't matter, accumulation or intensification, use a step loading approach where you peak at your RM on the last set. When would a cambered bar be good to use? So a cambered bar, which is these bars where it looks kind of like a yoke a bit, like in a way. So you have the barbell, you have side pins, and then you have the sleeves where the plates go. But usually the plates are about a foot lower than the barbell, so it displaces the center of mass lower, so which makes the movement a little bit technically easier. So if you have clients that struggle with back squat technique, you might want to use the cambered bar as a aid, if you want, as a tool to aid in the movement pattern. You can also use a cambered bar simply to switch motor unit recruitment. And you can also use the cambered bar with people who have shoulder issues, who have very poor external rotation, who can't really grab the barbell with a regular bar. Then the cambered bar becomes quite the effective tool, because you can just hold them to the side, so it's much more pleasant to the shoulder joint, if you want. Now you can also use the cambered bar for split squats, lunges. You can use a cambered bar for good mornings. You know, instead of always doing good mornings with a barbell, the cambered bar, what's interesting is the center of mass is different, but also as you're going down, the weights tend to shift forward a little bit, so it changes the lever arm a little bit. So that, you know, it's one more tool in your arsenal to kind of create a slight different response to training by tapping in different motor units because of different leverages or because of different position of center of mass. So I really like the cambered bar. It's a really cool tool, really good change of pace. And think outside the box. Like, it's fine to use that for remedial exercises like good morning or assistance work, like your split squats and stuff like that. It's not just something that you can only use with your squats. How do I typically design my circuit training classes? So I'm assuming here that by circuit training classes, this person is talking about the conditioning class. Where we use mostly modified strongman exercises. So if that's the case, I can answer it. So typically our conditioning classes, we like to use exercises with different modes of contractions, modalities, planes of movements, etc., etc. So a key rule of thumb is you need to have one exercise that's a lift, which is typically the one you're going to start with. So it could be a speed trap bar deadlift. It could be a tire flip. It could be a log press. So anything that's lift base. Then you want a carry type movement. So it could be a sandbag carry, farmer's walk, yoke carry. Okay. Then you have a sled type of movement, backward sled, forward sled, prowler, tank push. Okay. So anything that's dragging or pushing or pulling. Then finally, we love using animal walks. So bear crawl, duck walk, bunny hop. So all of these things, the animal walk, what's good about it is it's unloaded, but it requires you to brace. And it requires you to brace and move with using different muscles while being under fatigue, which is very, very important, especially if you're training athletes. If you're training athletes, and as soon as they get tired, they have no stability, no control, no bracing ability because they're too tired. This is when a lot of injuries tends to happen. But if you can train the athlete to be able to brace and maintain stability throughout while still being out of breath and under fatigue, then you're helping your case at reducing the likelihood of, like phony type of injuries. So the combination of these four types of movement for us in our conditioning sessions, we think we're getting a big bang for your buck training effect. And not only that, but it's also really good at transferring the strength you've built in the weight room with the more like sagittal plane dominant exercises that you use in the weight room into a little bit more diversity and more functional strength, if you want, during your conditioning session. So to have like a mix of these four things, these four modalities, you should get the most bang for your buck. What is my favorite forearm exercise? So to me, by far my favorite is the wrist roller, especially the Watson wrist roller, because it's a 2-inch thick handle. So like the added effect of having a thick grip as you're doing the wrist roller makes it way more challenging. What I like about the wrist roller is, first of all, the forearms for most, they tend to be a little bit more slow twitch. And because it's a smaller muscles and it recovers quick, you can afford to do higher frequency on forearm and a lot of density of work as well. So what I like about the wrist roller is you're doing a ton of concentric reps in a short amount of time. So the lactate builds up very, very quickly. Like you get a crazy pump. After you do like wrist roller with the Watson one, the pump you get in the forearms is crazy. Not only in the flexor, but the extensor as well. It's just this good overall pump you get, which I don't know, like I don't want to quote Arnold here, but let's just say that a pump makes you feel really good. So it's just a good, it's just a good feeling. I love that exercise. If you've never done wrist roller, try a wrist roller. And if you have the chance to use a thick grip wrist roller, like the pump and the feel you get in the forearms is just even more compounded.